Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Brain and Behavior. I am Dr. Arpadma from IIT Kanpur. This is week 8 of the course, and we are going to talk about the neuroscience of social cognition. Now, social cognitive neuroscience is a branch of neuroscience that seeks to understand the neural causes of social behavior. The idea is to understand the cognitive processes that facilitate social behavior and the brain regions that support these cognitive processes. Here, the emphasis is on studying how human behavior varies in response to situations and contexts that involve other people as well. Also, the focus is to investigate the nature of social interactions involving friends, family, romantic partners, colleagues, and even strangers, and also to understand how these social interactions shape our individual sense of self. Let's talk about anatomical substrates of social cognition. There are several interesting questions that can be posed about the neural basis of social cognition. For example, whether the processing of information about one's own self and others happens at the same location in the brain or in different regions of the brain. It is interesting to note that although several philosophers and scientists have studied the concept of self for several thousands of years, there is still a lack of a significant definition of self. Further, scientists have failed to localize a single area within the brain as the site for the self. To put forward a simple definition of self, Gazzaniga states that self is like a pastiche. It's made up of several separable processes with separable contents from a vast supply of sources, both from within and without the brain and body. For example, the prefrontal cortex has been implicated as a region for self related processing. The lateral aspect of the prefrontal cortex has two parts. One is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. The medial regions include the orbitofrontal cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. The regions of the prefrontal cortex that have been implicated in self-referential processing are the DLPFC, which is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and the posterior cingulate cortex. Also, the medial and the lateral parietal cortices. An important aspect of the sense of self in the subjective feeling that we have about ourselves. The regions of the brain that contribute to the subjective feelings and our sense of self are the orbitofrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the insula, as well as parts of the autonomic nervous system, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and the endocrine system that regulates bodily states, emotions, and reactivity. In this figure, you can see the different regions that have been implicated in self and other processing. You can see the anterior cingulate cortex, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the medial parietal cortex, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, orbitofrontal cortex, ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, parietal cortex, temporoparietal junction, and the superior temporal sulcus. Further, as memory is also an important aspect of self-referential processing, the temporal lobe is also an important for the cells of self. Also, there are brain regions and networks that facilitate our ability to understand others, which include the amygdala and its interconnections with superior temporal sulcus, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the orbitofrontal cortex, the ACC, that's the anterior cingulate cortex, and the fusiform area. These are regions which are typically associated with the mirror neuron systems, the temporal poles, the temporoparietal junction, and the medial parietal cortex. Let's talk a, let's talk a little bit about the possible deficits in social cognition. Several individuals having autism spectrum disorders demonstrate deficits in social behavior. Typically, individuals exhibit impaired social interaction along with other related deficits. These disorders include autism, Asperger's syndrome, childhood disintegrative disorder, Rett syndrome, and some other pervasive developmental disorders. Individuals suffering from autism are less interested in other individuals or social interactions, and they focus more on internal thoughts and inanimate objects around. Autistic individuals prefer to be engaged in repetitive routine behaviors and get upset when these behaviors are disrupted. Further, instead of looking for social interactions, autistic individuals engage in these repetitive behaviors by themselves and sometimes display head-banging behavior or rocking their bodies as a way to develop and cling on to those routines. Autistic individuals can sometimes also show hypersensitivity to particular kinds of sensory stimuli. For example, they might be irritated by too much light or too much sound. They might be irritated by particular temperature conditions, etc. Baron Cohen has postulated that autistic individuals may be directing their attention away from other individuals because of an inability to understand the mental state of other individuals. Baron Cohen proposed this term mind blindness to reflect the inability of autistic children to represent the mental states of others. Related symptoms include the impaired use of nonverbal cues to infer other people's emotional states. Moving further, autistic individuals also have difficulty in identifying emotional and mental states from facial expressions and cannot use this information in a manner that normal individuals can. For example, you and me, if we come across a particular person, we look at the particular person's mannerisms, maybe his facial expressions, his hand movements, etc., and we will be able to very quickly estimate that okay, if the person is angry, he's happy, he's in a good mood, in a bad mood, and we can use that information to tone down or tone up our interactions in a particular way. We'll use that knowledge to basically plan the way we are going to interact with that person. But autistic individuals have a real problem with these things. Let's take an example. When children are asked to organize pictures of faces according to their facial expressions, they can normally sort the faces of people according to their expressions. Say, for example, happy faces in one pile, sad faces in another pile, and so on. However, children with autism will not be able to categorize these pictures of faces on the basis of emotional expressions or facial expressions, but rather on the basis of physical features such as the overall shape of the face, the color, and so on. Now, let us talk a little bit about self knowledge. Several philosophers and philosophical traditions have emphasized the importance of knowing and understanding ourselves. Knowing about ourselves is imperative individual is imperative. Individuals develop self knowledge through self perception processes that are inclined to gather information about ourselves. For example, as the self is the perceiver, the perceived self information is slightly unique social cognitive process, and it in some sense forms an instance of what is called self appraisal. In addition, another task is that is important for social cognition is the task of distinguishing one's own self from the others. One's own sense of self also stems from being able to perceive the differences between self knowledge and knowledge of others. It's almost like you'll have to create a category or you'll have to create a contrast to understand that this is what I want, this is what somebody else wants. And because this is a choice that I've made, I am different from the other people. For instance, so that's basically what I was saying. For instance, individuals will need to realize their own choices in contrast with those of others. An individual may have his or her own preferences in terms of the choices made, say, for example, for food, recreation activities, choice of clothes, choice of words in how you want to say something, etc. Now, these may be different from that of others' choices, and therefore they will provide you with a sense of uniqueness from other people. Several important questions, basically in social neuroscience, center around uncovering the neural and psychological mechanisms that support the processing of information about one's self and other individuals. Also, on deciding whether these processes are similar or different from each other, and then finally focusing on how the brain achieves these two processes, basically, which are perception of the self and getting knowledge about oneself, and then perception of others, knowing their mental states, understanding them, so that you can have proper social interactions with people around you. Let's first talk about self referential processing. Now, one of the first instances of self-referential processing was put forward long ago by Craig and Lockhart's level of processing model of memory. If you remember from psychology class, according to this theory, the depth of processing of information basically affects the storage of information in memory. In their experiments, Craig and Lockhart and later Craig and Tulvin, etc., they observed that information is processed in a more meaningful manner. Information that is processed in a more meaningful manner has a better chance of being recalled than superficially learned information. As an extension of Craig and Lockhart's work, several labs basically sought to, investigate the nature of memory with respect to the manner of information processing. How are you going to store some information, and the way that you store particular information? How is that way going to, let us say, influence the recall or use of information at a later point in time? Now, it was observed that people recall significantly more information if it is processed in relation to themselves than when they process the information in any other way. So, if you remember something and you say, okay, this is relevant to me in some manner, let us say, if it is a cloth that you like too much, if it is a list of places maybe somebody is asking you to remember, and some of these places you've already been there and you have some memories attached to it, so you kind of process them more personally. That is where that list, or say for example at least those places where you have been to and you have a personal connect, will be remembered better. Say, for instance, again, I'm giving you another example. For instance, if it was found that individuals who are more likely to remember an adjective, say happy, sad, or punctual, if they were asked to determine whether and how well it describes themselves as compared to when they are asked that how well the adjective describes others. This enhanced ability to remember information processed in relation to ourselves is known as the self reference effect. Two different proposals have been offered to explain the reason behind the self-reference effect. One of the proposals suggests that the self may be a unique cognitive structure having unique mnemonic and or organizational elements that allows processing in a different way than other cognitive structures. Another proposal simply suggests that individuals typically have more knowledge about themselves, and therefore this prompts a more elaborate coding of the information that is related to the self. More specifically, the idea is that the evaluation of new information, say let's say the adjectives in this case, in relation to the amount of information that is stored about the self, allows for more elaborate encoding of the information and hence leads to better recall. Let's look at this example in a bit more detail. Suppose you have to remember a list of adjectives, and one of the adjectives is punctual. Now the thing is, if you want to remember the adjectives better, then you have to sort of process them in reference to yourself. One of the things you will do is, let's say, you will try and recall all the instances where you have been punctual and use that to basically store this adjective nicely, and tell yourself that yes, I am punctual because I have so many of these examples. Now what has happened is that on the basis of your older memory, you have anchored this adjective very well, and when the list recall time comes, when somebody is going to ask you about the adjectives in the list, you will have remembered this adjective particularly well because you have stored it in that manner. Now, while several behavioral studies have started to examine the competing hypotheses, imaging studies have served to reveal the neural basis of the self-reference effects. So, imaging studies have been particularly important in actually telling us, with respect to the brain, which are the areas which are responsible for this kind of self-reference effect. Now, to look at some of these possibilities in more detail, let us say if the self were a distinct cognitive structure and has its unique information processing, then different neural regions should be activated for the self-reference effect, and say for example other regions will be activated when you have to code information that is not self-relevant. Now, Kelly and colleagues in 2002 they conducted an fMRI study to test the above hypothesis. In their study, participants were asked to judge personality adjectives in three experimental conditions. First, in the relation to the self, say for example, does this trait describe you? Let's say, are you punctual? In relation to another person, does this trait describe, let us say, a famous person like George Bush, or finally, in relation to just its form in a more superficial sense, is this word presented in uppercase or lowercase? Now, as per the results, participants were found to be more likely to remember words from the self condition and less likely to remember words from the printed format condition. Again, this is this is definitely according to the predictions that Craig and Lockhart had made, that once you are processing information in relation to themselves, you are having more elaborate and more space coding, and you'll remember this information better. Now, with respect to the brain areas, the medial prefrontal cortex was found to be differentially activated in the self condition as compared to the other two conditions. The medial prefrontal cortex activity was also later found to predict which items would be actually remembered in a surprise memory test. So, items that have basically that showed medial prefrontal cortex activity while they were being encoded, it predicted that okay, these are the items that will be remembered better. Now, further, the relation between the medial prefrontal cortex and the self reference effect was also found to extend to instances where participants were asked to just view themselves to other person's eyes. Moreover, self-referential processing has also been found to produce positive moving shifts in the ERPs that emerge from a midline location consistent with the location of the medial prefrontal cortex. So, both from fMRI studies and ERP, you can see that the medial prefrontal cortex is being implicated in self-referential processing or the self-reference effect. So, in some sense, it is established that the self reference effect is strongly linked with the processing in the medial prefrontal cortex. Now let's talk about the self-descriptive personality traits. Another important instance of the self-related processing concerns the self-descriptive personality traits, the adjectives. For example, asking the question of whether a particular trait describes you or others. I could give you a list of adjectives. Let us say I was talking about punctual. Let me take a different adjective now. Let me say if the adjective is conscientious. Now I could ask you if you is the does the word conscientious describe your personality well, or let us say it describes the personality of another famous person. You can think about a film star, a cricketer, or whatever. Now, it has been observed that the individuals typically have a better memory for traits that they judge in relation to themselves as opposed to those judged in relation to others. Indeed, when one has to decide whether a trait is self-descriptive, as I was saying earlier, one draws on the instances of self-perceptions that provide us with a summary of our personality traits, whereas judgments in relation to others usually draw from a few specific episodes or instances from our lives where the concerned individuals have displayed the behavior exhibiting the said traits. Let me explain this to you in a better sense. Now, if you have to answer that whether you're conscientious or not, you'll have a large amount of data spanning your entire life, and so many instances where you have behaved in a particular manner that would suggest that you are conscientious, or let's say you're not conscientious. Now, when you have to answer this question with regards to the other person, let us say a close friend or another famous person, let us say somebody like, a national leader, or a Bollywood star or somebody, and suppose somebody asks you that, okay, does X seem conscientious to you? Now, basically, that will obviously be based on a very few instances in, let us say, the course of your life, that you saw some behavior by these individuals which would suggest that whether they are conscientious or not. And in that sense, the coding is rather superficial, because you're not really personally very attached to that entire thing, and so you will not be super sure, and in that sense your memory that or the traces of memory that will be formed will be that much more weaker. Now, Klein and colleagues in 1992 decided to conduct a study to investigate whether self description judgments actually rely on the recall of specific autobiographical episodes. Participants were shown personality adjectives on the screen, and they were asked to rate it for self descriptiveness. Say, for example, the sentence would be, are you punctual? Rate it on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 11 or whatever. Or you could just alternatively be asked to just define the word. So, what does punctual actually mean? As a control condition, participants were shown a blank screen with no adjectives. After this initial task, participants described after this initial task, participants described a particular instance from their lives when they demonstrated that given personality characteristics. So, what are the instances of your life where you have been very punctual? Now, here the researchers recorded the time that was taken by the participants to arrive at the set description. How easy or difficult, or how much time does it take you to come up with those instances of punctuality? Suppose there are very few instances that you have been punctual, it will take you more time. Suppose there are many instances that you have been punctual, you will be able to recall that instance very quickly. For the control condition, participants described an episode where when they demonstrated a trait that had not been asked about. So give me an example of when you were lazy. Okay, so you have not been asked about lazy in the list apparently, and then you just asked to describe this, and then you basically again the time you spend in arriving that description will be measured and compared to the earlier scenario. So the idea behind this experiment was that, let us say, if self-descriptions depend upon drawing from episodic memory of specific instances from your life, participants may be found to be faster to recall an episode where they exhibit the personality characteristic that they already had been asked about. So in the second instance, if you have already been asked about, this in the list or the adjectives, whether this describes yourself or not, you will be able to quickly recall that. Okay, so this is basically will form the whole time taken in the arriving at the description thing. However, the researchers could not really find any difference between the self-judgment definition and the control conditions. These results led the researchers to conclude that judgments about self-descriptiveness of characteristics or traits may not depend upon the recall of specific instances from episodic memory. So they say it is something else that is probably deriving, or sorry, that's something is something else that is possibly driving this self-reference effect, and not really, picking up of information from episodic memory. Such an assumption would lead us to the possibility of being able to have a sense of self even in cases when there is a loss of autobiographical memory. So, for example, even if you don't have a lot of autobiographical memory remaining, suppose you're suffering from amnesia or some accident, even then you will still retain the sense of self. If the sense of self were entirely based on your memories, then as soon as the memory goes, let us say you have any of these syndromes, Korsakoff syndrome or some injury or stroke, God forbid, you will sort of remember, you will also lose your sense of self. But that is not what happens with amnesia patients. They have a very well defined sense of self even though their memories are lacking. So this is, in some sense, if you try and understand it, it is fairly intuitive. Now the same has been demonstrated in patients who had dense amnesia. Let's talk about two patients were considered. One had an anterograde amnesia severe, one another had a retrograde amnesia severe, and the patient's name were DB and KC. Patient DB's memory problems happened after a heart attack as a result of the as a result of the transient loss of oxygen to the brain, that is hypoxia. So his amnesia was basically rooted in hypoxia of the brain. Patient Casey's memory loss was basically as a result of a motorcycle accident which caused extensive brain damage. Although either of the two patients could not recall anything from their earlier lives, they were found capable of describing their own personalities very well, as also verified by other family members. So they were able to give descriptions of, let us say, if they were lazy or punctual, or whether they were conscientious or they were not, and those kind of things. So this result can also be interpreted as the preservation of a more general social knowledge rather than the preservation of self knowledge. So in some sense, you can say that, okay, maybe it's not really the sense of self that is speaking out here. It's basically a general social kind of knowledge, generally about how people are and how they behave and so on. Although typically patients in Korsakoff syndrome have extreme difficulty in recalling old events, in a study, patients with Korsakoff syndrome were presented with pictures of two men and were narrated a biographical story about each. So one of the men were described as a good guy while the other was described as a bad guy. So this story was narrated. A month later, it was found that most patients preferred the picture of a man described as a good guy, even though they could not really recall any of the biographical information that was read out about him. So, Klein's work basically led to useful insights about the nature of self knowledge processing. It led to the observation that trait based self knowledge is considerably robust and can survive several types of injury or insult or something to the brain. This work also establishes the fact that not only self knowledge is a unique type of knowledge, rather, it is not a single entity but that is described through multiple systems. Indeed, different systems have been discovered that are dedicated to processing different aspects of self knowledge. For instance, one system is found to be dedicated for episodic memories about oneself. Another system for sense of personal agency, like I am in control, I am doing these things, I am not doing these things, and so on. One is dedicated for the ability to recognize your body in the mirror, and also several other systems dedicated to other aspects of self knowledge. Now let's talk about self-reference as a baseline mode of brain function. Now, what has happened is, in recent times, recent neuroscientific research has suggested that the medial prefrontal cortex has unique physiological properties that may allow self-referential processing even while you're not actively engaged in a task of thinking about yourselves, or we are not engaged in thinking about ourselves. It has been observed that even at rest, that is when participants are not really performing any task, the activation of specific brain regions, as measured by the MRI apparatus, was found to be steadily increasing and comparable to the activation of other specific brain regions when those regions were actively engaged in performing certain tasks. Now, when participants were later asked about these period, you go to the participant and ask them, okay, we saw that your brain was especially active, or these regions of your brain were especially active between timestamps this and this. What were you doing at this time? Mostly participants' answers basically gave a hint that they were engaged in some kind of self-referential processing. They were either planning their day ahead, the lunch they're going to have next, what is going on in their lives, and things like that. Indeed, a network of brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex, has actually been found to have higher metabolic rates at these periods of rest when the brain is not really actively engaged in doing some tasks. Rachel Gusnard and colleagues have proposed that even while the brain is at rest, several areas of the brain are continuously engaged in a number of physiological processes, which has been referred to as the default mode of brain function. These brain regions have been called the default mode network and is supposed to consist of the medial prefrontal cortex, precuneus temporoparietal junction, medial temporal lobe, lateral parietal cortex, and posterior cingulate cortex. So these are the regions which are basically part of this default network of the brain, which basically is also active while you are at rest. Now, it has been proposed that this higher metabolic rates in the medial prefrontal cortex indexes some degree of self-referential processing, say, for example, thinking about our current and future course of action, etc. This view is referred to as the sentinel hypothesis. Here you can look at the regions which are involved in the default mode. So you can see the prefrontal cortex, the inferior parietal lobule, lateral temporal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Now, the default mode network has been found to be most active when our attention is focused away from the external stimuli and towards internal mental states. This network is found to be connected with the medial temporal lobe memory system, which can explain why we often consider the past in the default rambling. So, basically, because this system draws on memory sources, it is, in some sense, but natural that we will think about the past, or let us say, because we're thinking about the past, we're drawing from these regions. Now, the default mode network is found to be deactivated when individuals are actively engaged in performing tasks that engage our cognitive resources like attention, etc. So, for example, some people have this tendency of starting to think about themselves too deeply, or starting to, getting lost in daydreams. And typically, what they are doing in these daydreams is they are basically thinking about themselves. What have they done right? What have they done wrong? What should they do further? What have they done in the past that was not so correct? What are their life prospects and so on. So what happens is, sometimes people have a tendency to get lost in these kind of thoughts, but and that is basically what is probably prompting this kind of activations in the medial prefrontal cortex regions, as we just saw. But if people are engaged in tasks which demand their full attention, and they engage their cognitive resources, then this default mode network sort of gets slightly deactivated, because the resources are channeled to other areas of the brain, which are basically being involved in doing the task at hand. So, however, while individuals are performing active tasks that involve self-referential judgments, the medial prefrontal cortex is deactivated only to a lesser extent. Okay, so we are talking about a baseline where there is some activation already going on. Okay, so it becomes deactivated when you're doing some actively engaging tasks, and this deactivation is much lesser when you're doing tasks that do not really require, that actually require, sorry, that do require self-referential judgments. Now, several studies have shown that various tasks activate a set of regions remarkably similar to the default mode network. This includes tasks like autobiographical memory tasks, tasks envisioning the self in the future or navigating to a different location, and tasks that involve personal moral dilemmas. Moreover, similar regions of the brain are also found to be activated when individuals are thinking about their beliefs and intentions of other people. Hence, the default mode network seems to be involved in more than just self referential processing. Now, if one looks at the task he or she engages in, and the tasks that basically engage, the default mode network, the core component of these tasks is to be able to adopt an alternative perspective. Say, for example, imagine if you are going to a very important meeting and you get stuck in a traffic jam. What would you do? How will things happen? Each of these kinds of situations basically requires an individual to focus on thoughts that are removed from one's immediate surroundings. They involve some kind of fantasizing, anticipating what will happen if, let us say, you're studying for the exam, what will happen if the power goes, if there's a power cut. Do you have enough backup? How will you do things? Are you prepared to, read in lesser light, and so on and so forth? This is exactly the same kind of processes that are involved when one needs to infer the mental states of others. Basically, it's very similar to how you want to infer the mental states of others, because you don't have something happening in your immediate surroundings. You have to anticipate. Okay, if, let us say, if a boy or a girl is thinking about it. So if I propose this person X, what is the possible feeling that they will go through? What will be the possible response, and things like that. It seems, therefore, that the processes that give rise to our understanding of other people's mental states and thought processes, and our own thought processes, overlap significantly. Jason Mitchell at Harvard University suggests that the high activity observed at the resting state may be a signal to the fact, may signal the fact that the human mind naturally prefers simulated scenarios over the immediate external environment. It seems like that the human mind prefers this kind of daydreaming, this kind of anticipation to some degree. Mitchell has further proposed that the increased activity of the medial prefrontal cortex, the temporoparietal junction, and the medial parietal cortex interface with non social forms of thought. So, if these regions which form the default network are overactive and overindulgent all the time, they will start, interfering with other non social forms of thought. Maybe just doing your work, for example. According to Mitchell, the solution to this cognitive problem may require interrupting the spontaneous mental processes that otherwise would induce a readiness for social thought, and it would basically all. So the idea is that, because if your mind is susceptible to this kind of self-referential thought processing, and it happens spontaneously every time you have some time on your hands, it might be useful that the solution to this, to staying ahead of this, is to always engage in tasks, to basically try and interrupt these spontaneous mental processes. And this interrupting of these mental processes would actually work to our benefit and enhance our interactions with the non-social aspects of environment, things like which are mundane, which are not necessarily social, but you'll get better at them because you're now controlling this whole tendency of your mind to start rambling about itself. It would basically yeah, so that is what I wanted to. Now let's talk about self as a motivated process. Now research has suggested that judgments about the self are sometimes inaccurate. They are often inaccurate, actually. Several studies have indicated that individuals have unrealistically positive self perceptions. For instance, it has been demonstrated that over 70% high school students rank themselves as above average in leadership ability, while 93% of the college professors believe that they are above average at their job. It's people congratulating themselves, maybe just to keep the tempo high, maybe just to keep themselves in good spirits. Similarly, it has been observed that over 50% people believe that they are above average in intelligence, physical attractiveness, and several other parameters. So it seems that people like to tell themselves a good story about themselves. In some sense, it would bias you to think in a certain manner. Moreover, it also seems that individuals believe that they are more likely to experience positive future events and less likely to experience negative future events. I can take a current example. I'm sure everybody is probably watching the lecture from their homes or their mobile phones, and this is the time where the coronavirus pandemic is struck the world. One of the reasons why a lot of people are getting infected, or you must have heard so much about what happened in Italy, was that people went out and they met their friends and they did all kinds of social activities thinking that it cannot happen to them. So people generally have this idea of that, okay, if there is something bad, it will certainly not happen to me. Okay, and then there are people say, for example, in India there is this whole concept of wishful thinking that Indian immunity is very good, and because of our very good Indian immunity, we will not catch coronavirus. Even though, on the contrary, we are also sort of seeing so many cases, and the count of infected persons versus also the death count is increasing day by day. So this is one of the tendencies that people usually. Now, some research has indicated that distinct higher order prefrontal regions allow individuals to focus selectively on positive aspects about themselves. So, it's basically the higher order prefrontal regions that are allowing this to happen. They are basically allowing individuals to focus selectively on only the positive aspects about themselves, not the negative aspects. In an fMRI study conducted by Moran and colleagues, participants were asked to make a series of descriptive judgments similar to earlier self-reference studies which you just seen. As expected, participants tended to select more positive tendencies for themselves and negative tendencies describing, as say, for example, describing others. Now, differences in the activity in the ventral anterior cingulate cortex was found to be associated with the judgment of positive adjectives as compared to the negative adjectives, and this difference was found to be more pronounced for adjectives that were self-descriptive. So most positive adjectives were self-descriptive. Even within that, the positive adjectives were basically judged as self-descriptive, and the ventral anterior cingulate cortex was found to be here. Now, in another fMRI study, researchers found that a similar region of the anterior cingulate cortex was activated differentially when participants were asked to imagine experiencing a positive event for the future as compared to imagining a possible negative event. Several similar studies indicate that anterior cingulate cortex is an important region of the brain that allows the distinction between positive self-relevant information and negative self-relevant information, allowing us to prepare, basically to focus more on just the positive sides and the positive information. Further research suggests that even though self perceptions are highly biased towards the positive side, they're not really completely removed from reality. So there is a sense, so even though we typically are more biased towards ourselves, there is, let us say, at least some ounce of truth in that positive bias. For example, accurate self-perception, it is a very important aspect of appropriate social behavior. Individuals need to be informed about their own behaviors to be certain that they are following the social norms and avoiding social mistakes, basically not making a fool of themselves in a social situation. However, patients with orbitofrontal cortex damage are observed to have these unrealistically positive self-views with along with inappropriate social behavior. So they have this extremely good view of themselves, but their behavior is sometimes socially inappropriate. To explore this possibility, Jennifer Beer and colleagues in 2006 videotaped healthy control participants, patients with orbitofrontal cortex damage and patients with lateral prefrontal cortex damage, while these participants were engaged in a structured social interaction with a stranger, complete stranger, wherein the conversation was being driven by the stranger who was posing a series of questions and these individuals are asking and conversing about. It was found that with people with orbitofrontal cortex damage tended to bring up impolite social conversation topics, some things that they had just agreed to, that this is polite, this is impolite, and then once they start talking, they basically unknowingly almost bring up these impolite conversation topics. After the initial conversation, participants were asked to rate appropriateness of their answers, considering that they were talking to a stranger. So they were asked, okay, okay, now the talk is done. Now you tell us what did you feel about your behavior. Now, while the patients with orbitofrontal cortex damage believed that they had performed very well on the task, they were actually later embarrassed when they were shown the videotaped interview where they had committed these errors more and more, and they had, crossed the line, so to speak, a few times. Such a result basically suggests that orbitofrontal cortex may be involved in having a spontaneous, accurate self-perception, and also it may have insights about their own behavior as regards the following of social norms. Let's talk about how this information can be used to predict our own mental states. Now, when participants are asked to make predictions about their mental states in novel scenarios, fMRI studies have revealed that they constantly engage the ventral region of the medial prefrontal cortex, that is the VMPFC. Studies performed with patients having damage to the VMPFC have supported this idea that this region subserves the predictions about an individual's own likes and dislikes. For instance, in a study by fellows in FARA, three groups of patients were tested: patients with OFC damage, patients with DLPFC damage, and healthy controls. Participants were asked about their preference between two actors, foods, or colors. For example, do you prefer Ben Affleck or Matthew Broderick? Or do you prefer dosa or uttapam or something like that, isn't it? It was found that while the preferences of healthy controls and DLPFC damaged patients were stable over time, patients with ventromedial prefrontal cortex damage made inconsistent choices. They were all over the place and they also wanted to change their choices repeatedly. So it seems that there is some problem making these choices here. Activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is also found to be involved when participants are making judgments about their mental states with respect to future events. Researchers could actually predict the extent to which the participants would make short-sighted memory decisions by just looking at the magnitude of the VMPFC reduction. So in some sense, this test or this procedure is also predictive of participants' future behavior. These results indicate that the VMPFC is involved in the ability to stimulate future events from a first person perspective. So it kind of gives you the sense of what might happen in the future, what will you feel like, and so on and so forth. So I hope this basic introduction about self-referential processing and self-knowledge would have been clear to you. Obviously, you know I'm following a book called Gazzaniga and a book by Gazzaniga called Cognitive Neuroscience. And thank you for this.